Welcome to this week's episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. On this week's episode, we figure out what the hell is going on in Syria. Let's get started. It's crazy to think that last week in our podcast, we talked a little bit about Bashar al-Assad, the leader of Syria, and the 500,000 people that have been killed in his civil war, not realizing that over the last week, that civil war would be sparked and it would become top story for this week's news. It is not often that we have a chance to really see the hypocrisy in action. We have seen the world for over 1 year now complain about the quote-unquote genocide in Gaza and all the other things that they lie about in order to demonize Israel. Very rarely do we have two conflicts going on at the exact same time in order to compare the hypocritical nature of people in the West. But with the restarting of this issue in Syria, we could see firsthand how people don't care about conflicts unless Israel's involved. As we like to say very frequently, no Jews, no news. And despite some basic discussions on mainstream media, for the most part, no one's talking about it. We posted on our Instagram this weekend the irony in the fact that there are no protests in the street. No one is calling for the poor women and children to be saved. Why? Why is it that no one seems to care when 500,000 and now more Syrian people are being killed? I guess as long as it's not supposedly at the hand of the Jews. So on this week's episode, I thought maybe I would discuss what's been going on in Syria. I know I usually talk about Israel and talk about issues that pertain to the Jewish community, but this does, in essence, being a next-door neighbor, affect Israel in a few different ways. And a few of you might be unaware of the situation in Syria because you only kind of tuned into this issue on October 7th and have been trying to learn. So on this episode, I'm going to try to do my best to give you a basic overview of what's going on in Syria and how that's going to affect the Middle East as a whole and the state of Israel. For those of you listeners that have been with me for a while and have listened to many of our podcasts, you'll hear a lot of similarities between the creation of the state of Syria and many of the same things that happened with many other states in the area. The Middle East, technically today, is all man-made by the colonial powers, and Syria is no different. Syria was under the control of the Ottoman Empire following the multiple caliphates that existed in the area. After the Arab conquest, of course, they took over the entire Middle East and North Africa. That was changed to the Ottoman Empire, which was a Turkish Muslim leadership, until eventually the Arab world was gathered together in order to destroy the Ottoman Empire, helping the British get rid of the Ottoman Turks in World War I. As some of you may recall from my old episodes, the colonizing powers promised the Arabs a state, but then reneged on the deal, and secretly, under the Sykes-Picot Agreement, chopped up the whole area into colonies. So the French and the British split up a whole bunch of areas to give themselves some more colonies. Syria, along with Lebanon, was given to the French, as opposed to the area of British Mandate of Palestine that was given to the British, hence the name. For many years, there was some tension between the colonizing power and the local Syrians, much like what was happening in British Mandate of Palestine with the Jews trying to throw the British out. And eventually, in the 1940s, after World War II, these colonizing powers decided to get out of the colonizing game and create independent states everywhere in the Middle East, except for Israel. The first attempt at Syrian government, not by a colonial power, was someone from the Ba'ath Party. You'll recognize the Ba'ath Party from people like Saddam Hussein and many other countries around the Middle East. This was a Sunni movement who attempted to control various populations, Christians, Shiites, Sunni people, under Sunni leadership. And as is unfortunately a staple of everywhere in the Middle East, other than Israel, those Sunni leaders came down very hard on people who were not part of their group. They would subjugate people, which would tend to cause a civil war. There's a very long and detailed history here between the small civil wars that were happening between the Sunnis and the Shiites at various times throughout the 60s. let's just say that it wasn't exactly a peaceful and well-run country. It was essentially coup after coup after coup, both sides trying to vie for power. Meanwhile, as you may have remembered from some of our other podcasts, various attempts by Syria to take over Israel in 1948, in 1967, led to a number of defeats. And this obviously doesn't go well for the people in charge in Syria, which then led to one final coup by Hafez al-Assad, who overthrows the current president of Syria and imprisons him. Hafez al-Assad and now his son, Bashar al-Assad, are both Shiite Muslims. For those of you who might not understand the difference between Sunni and Shia Muslims, there is a slight difference. Both are Muslims, both follow the same practices. It comes down to minor differences between the two, but the most notable difference between the two branches is who was to succeed after Muhammad was dead. The Sunni believe that Abu Bakr, the father-in-law of Muhammad, was the rightful heir to the Islamic future, whereas the Shia Muslims believe Ali ibn Abi Talib, Muhammad's cousin, was the rightful leader of the Islamic people. And this divide is pretty much what splits the two, which is the rightful branch of Islam, and it has caused many wars between the two. And Syria is no different. When the Shiite leader Hafez al-Assad took over, of course, like many other leaders, including the Ba'ath Party, would subjugate the opposing people, the Sunnis. And as a forever dictator, Hafez put his son, Bashar al-Assad, who is currently in power, into power, and he continued to make sure to reign with an iron fist over his people, including, unfortunately, subjugating the Sunni people. So this sets the stage for the somewhat modern era. We have a dictator who's been in power, oppressing half of their country, ruling with an iron fist, and using violence in order to maintain power over his country. This is how we get to the 2011 Arab Spring. Many people in the Middle East were very unhappy with their dictators and their governments, and protests broke out from Tunisia to Libya and Egypt, Yemen, Syria, Bahrain. Everybody was going against these status quo dictators who were very oppressive to the opposing form of Islam. Demonstrations were taking place across the Middle East, including the Egyptians overthrowing the Sunni Muslim Brotherhood in order to throw them out of power. Syria and their dictator Bashar al-Assad decided to squash this by any means necessary, which included murdering many of his own people and doing a full-out war against the people who were protesting his rule. This included using chemical weapons against his own people. Some estimates are anywhere between 200 to 500,000 people killed in this civil conflict. One thing that Syria had in their favor is they had a lot of friends. The Middle East is filled with Sunni Muslims running countries, very powerful countries, and Syria is a Shiite country. So on their side is the Shiite leadership of Iran, who supports them for a number of reasons, and we'll get to that in a minute. But they also have the Russians on their side for a few reasons. The Russians supply the Syrians with tons and tons of weapons, which is great for the Russian economy, but it also allows the Russians to use Syrian airspace and Syrian land in order to have military bases. Most notably, Russia requires having a port in Syria to allow their navy to be in the Mediterranean Sea. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to take their ships into the Mediterranean Sea. So Syria is very strategic for Russia. And both Iran and Russia understand that if Bashar al-Assad was gone, that their foothold in that region as Shiites and as a military power would be done. As Bashar al-Assad and his allies start cracking down on these protests, it turns into a full-out civil war. Many people who were in government forces decided to abandon those government forces to fight for the opposition side because of the way in which the government was coming down on the regular people, along with many of the Sunni groups who were totally against Assad and his Shiite oppression of their people. Many of these groups, under various names and affiliations, decided to work together in order to try to overthrow Assad in a coup. And that coup lasted for a very long time. The civil war between Assad and his forces versus the opposition forces lasted for many, many years until only recently. And not to make this even more challenging and difficult, but just to show you how difficult this became, the opposition groups that were fighting the Shiite government of Syria had some help also. They had help from Turkey. The Turkish government, made up of Sunni Muslims, also didn't care much for the Shiite Syrian leadership. And so they were funneling weapons and support and money to the opposition in order to get rid of Bashar al-Assad. So you can see how this Syrian civil war is kind of not really a civil war. It is a massive international proxy war. And let's not forget that the United States gets involved by arming the Kurdish forces. The Kurds are a minority group trying to protect themselves in northern Syria, who right now are being bombed by Turkey, but also get bombed by Syria, and they're just trying to defend themselves and live their lives. So you have all of these groups working together in this proxy war, really. And it's a religious proxy war between Sunnis and Shiites. As the war between the Syrians and the opposition forces continued, the Syrians needed help. And who did they call? They called Iran. Iran, who happens to have an entire Shiite army in southern Lebanon called Hezbollah. So Hezbollah goes into Syria, starts massacring local Sunni people in order to put down the opposition to the Assad regime. By 2016 to 2017, multiple attempts for ceasefires were brokered. Finally, a ceasefire did happen between Syria and the opposition. There's been relative peace, and that's kind of where we've been at since that time until this weekend. And this weekend, all hell broke loose in Syria. The opposition forces, somewhat out of nowhere, completely overtook many parts of Syria, including one of their biggest cities, Aleppo. Experts are saying that this is absolutely not a surprise to happen now, considering the fact that Syria is in such a delicate position. I obviously don't have to remind you that Hezbollah has been pretty badly weakened by the Israeli army, and Iran has proved itself to be a lot less strong than we assumed it was. So therefore, they too are kind of out of the picture. The last domino to fall would be Russia, one of Syria's biggest backers, who actually has bases within Syria. And as you obviously know, they are very busy right now and very weak from Ukraine and that whole war over there. So it is absolutely not a surprise that the people who were fighting against the Assad regime would take this opportunity in order to take out that regime now that all its protection has been removed. Some experts are saying the reason why they waited till the exact moment of the Hezbollah ceasefire was because they didn't want to be seen as working with or for Israel while Israel was attacking Hezbollah. So they waited until that was done and the ceasefire took place to implement this attack. And boy, did it ever work. People are saying that so much land has been taken in such a short amount of time that Assad actually left to flee to Russia with his family. He clearly has lost complete control of his country. Russia has begun trying to do some bombing of certain areas in order to take out the opposition fighters. But there has to be a huge regrouping right now. And I don't know if Syria can do it with their limited help from other people. So what does this really mean for the wider Middle East, but especially for Israel? As we can see, this is sort of a power play between Turkey and Iran for Sunni or Shiite domination over the land. Iran needs to keep this piece of land called Syria because it is literally the gateway from them to Lebanon, where they have Hezbollah as their army. In order to smuggle their weapons, get their money, get their men, they need Syria. So they will try very hard to keep it. And they need Assad in power because Assad is aligned with them. Once Assad is gone, they no longer have that corridor. If Syria falls and goes Sunni, that might actually be a good thing for Israel because they won't have that corridor to fund and get weapons to Hezbollah, and therefore Hezbollah might sort of wither and die. This would be fantastic news for Israel. And let's not forget the people of Lebanon who would love to have their country back. But the problem is, and the challenge is, that Turkey, as we now know, is harboring Hamas, who brought them in from Qatar, is clearly not pro-Israel. In fact, they've just cut ties with Israel officially. So having a Turkey-aligned Sunni group in control of Syria isn't necessarily going to be any better. Many of the groups that the Turkish are funding are very well-known Islamic extremist groups. Think Hamas, for example. Hamas is a Sunni group funded by Iran, Shiites, but there are groups in Syria that are Sunni groups who also hate Israel just like Hamas does. Some people may say that at least at this point, Syria is so busy that they can't be attacking Israel, so therefore it's a good thing. But however this plays out, it might be bad for Israel. In the end, this is a very crazy time right now, and there is a lot of moving parts. We don't know what's happening exactly on the ground or where this will end up. There is an absolute power struggle between Sunni and Shiite Muslims in Syria for control over that land. And depending on how this ends, it may reshape the Middle East entirely, and not necessarily for the better. I have said on this podcast before that there is something about the tribalism about Arab culture that for some reason lends itself to civil war and death on all sides. The only way that it seems these countries can sort of stay stable is with, I hate to say, a ruthless dictator. They're not great people. They harm a lot of their own people. But one thing you can say is that it creates some stability in some sense. For example, Bashar al-Assad, despite being a crazy person who has a horrible record of murdering his own people, the border with Syria is relatively quiet for the most part. He maintains control through unfortunate means. Whereas if you have this opposition force in power, we really don't know what's going to happen. They could be 10 times worse. They could actually make it a hot border with Syria. We can start seeing the rockets of Hezbollah and of Hamas now coming from Syria. So with Assad in power, despite being a bad situation for the people of Syria, it might be the only way to keep their people in control. Whereas the next group that comes in, someone like the Muslim Brotherhood, the Ba'ath Party, like Saddam Hussein, those were not great people either. And they definitely weren't happy with Israel. So only time will tell how this is going to reshape the Middle East. But hopefully this podcast gave you a little bit of context for when you do hear and see some of the things going on in the news. You'll have a better idea of what's really going on and what the outcomes might be depending on which side is winning. One thing is for sure, that innocent civilians will be caught up in the crossfire between these two powers vying for control. And whoever wins will definitely continue to oppress the opposing people. And sadly, whatever the hell is going on in Syria right now, I can guarantee you the Western world will not care about those innocent people, because no Jews, no news. This has been another episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. Don't forget to check us out on social media at jdr.podcast and check out some of our other episodes on your favorite podcast source. We'll see you next time.